Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Utilizing Elements of Behavioral Design in Improving Hospital-OPO Communication. We're glad that all of you could join us, and we have a terrific webinar presentation planned for you today. My name is Corey Bryant. I'm the Communications Manager for the Alliance, and we have just a few logistical items to go over before we begin today's webinar. For those of you who have never joined us on this webinar platform before, the chat feature is located in the bottom left-hand corner. If you have any questions that come up during the webinar, please feel free to submit them at any time. And once the presentation is complete, we'll have some time for our presenters to address as many of your questions as time allows. We are recording this webinar, so we will not be opening the phone lines. That means all questions must be submitted electronically using that chat feature. Registration is currently open for our next transplant webinar addressing risks of coronary artery disease post-transplant. So be sure to join us for that on May 22nd at 3 p.m. Eastern. Registration is also open for our next Get Connected webinar, Getting to Yes with the Coroner and ME. That's coming your way on June 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can register for all of these webinars and more on our website at organdonationalliance.org. For today's webinar, we are offering 1 CEPC credit and 1 nursing contact hour courtesy of Iowa Donor Network. Everyone listening to today's webinar is entitled to claim continuing education credit. If you're listening in a group, and we know that many of you often do, please make sure to get the evaluation email from your group lead. It's a very brief online evaluation which will allow you to receive your credit. Now, as a reminder, for nursing, you have 14 days to claim your CEs, and for CEPCs, you'll have 30 calendar days. At this point, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Sayona John. Dr. John is the Medical Director for the Neuroscience ICU at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. Dr. John, we're glad to have you with us, and at this point, I will turn it over to you to introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Corey, and good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Ruth Schmidt and Paul Keck. Ruth is a visiting industry professor and Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Institute of Design at the Illinois Institute of Technology. She previously served as a senior leader at Dublin, where she led teams in applying design-informed innovation strategy to solve complex challenges and grow new innovation functions within client organizations in the healthcare and financial service industries. She led the development of Dublin's Behavioral Design, POV, and Practitioner Toolkit, which integrates key principles from behavioral economics with the perspective of user experience to provide an actionable, disciplined approach to de-risking innovation and increasing user adoption. Paul Keck is an innovation manager at Dublin, helping clients understand, interpret, and translate user experiences through applying and coaching others in human-centered design strategy, research, and communication. As a co-developer of the Behavioral Design Toolkit, Paul continues to coach other colleagues at Deloitte in the application of behavioral design on client projects in the public sector, finance, and healthcare. So before we get started with a case discussion, could you explain to us the term behavioral design, as many of us are not familiar with it?
Absolutely. So behavioral design, or behavioral economics, as it's often commonly known, basically came as a response to more traditional economics. And in traditional economics, the assumption is that people are always rational, that they always weigh their choices with rationality, and they have all the information they need to make smart decisions, and they always act in their best interest. But probably any of us, both speaking and on the phone, recognize that there are many situations where we don't do that. And that can be whether we're not saving enough for retirement. It can be things about how we don't necessarily have the right health care regimen, that we know we should go running, but we decide we don't want to. It can even be as simple as having difficulty making a choice of which toothpaste brand to buy when you have, what feel like 10,000 choices in front of you. So all of these things that we have difficulty processing and difficulty making smart decisions are not because we're broken as human beings, but it's simply because we think differently and there are cognitive biases that get in our way. So what you see in front of you are a whole constellation, and these are but a small sample of some of the things that our brains just do, and we can think of them primarily as shortcuts. They're just things that our brains do in order to keep us going throughout the day, but sometimes it does mean that we make decisions which aren't quite as smart as they could be. Sometimes this notion has become popularized as nudging sometimes to help us get over some of these biases. So that may be a familiar term as well. And in fact, there's a fellow named Richard Thaler who just won the Nobel Prize last year for a lot of work that he did in this particular domain. So this idea that we make mistakes is a very common thing, but the more that we understand that, the more we can make better decisions. So if we think beyond the idea of nudging, though, which may be a little bit more of a targeted idea, we can start to develop a bit of a sense of the types of different inputs that feed how we make decisions well or not. So if we just think of this slide in front of us as a little bit of a framework to think through this, and we'll refer to it throughout. So there may be things just in terms of our identity or our sense of kinship, whether that's family or a professional setting, which can inform our sense of self and help us decide whether something is right for us or not. There are also preconceptions that we bring to any situation. We're never facing a blank slate. We're always bringing our perceptions from the past and prior experience. But we all know we're also very easily influenced by our social setting, or even by something as simple as, for example, seeing an article in the newspaper. Suddenly that may be front of mind, and you carry that with you, and that can inform your choices. When we move to things around how to assess our choices, the way that choices are presented can make a big difference. So something that's presented first feels different than something presented last. We also have a lot of difficulty in balancing present and future tense. And we see a lot of examples of that actually in situations like healthcare, where we make present tense decisions which we know are not necessarily smart future tense, but because the present is so concrete, it's hard to uproot that. And the barriers and enablers that get in our way or that can help us, the more we understand what is helping people to make smart choices or derailing them, the better that we can present options and design situations that will be good for them. And then finally, things like feedback or the sense of the full experience can help us to understand how to better set up approaches and to understand communication. So this just provides us with a little bit of language and a little bit of structure to talk through the case that we will and how behavioral design plays a role.
So let's begin our discussion with a clinical case that can bring this content to life. So we have a 20-year-old otherwise healthy male. He does have a reported history of heavy smoking and alcohol use. He develops an acute debilitating headache, followed by a seizure-like activity and loss of consciousness at home. The family calls 911. EMS transports the patient to a nearby community hospital emergency department, where he gets intubated on presentation. Now, the family is shocked and fearful. The treatment team at the emergency department is focusing on aggressive treatment of the critically ill patient, and the goal of their treatment is recovery of the patient. The OPO has not been consulted at that point, and in hindsight, they perceived this as a missed opportunity because the patient had already met clinical triggers.
So we can start to identify how some of the behavioral economics principles are already starting to come to life in a situation like this. So if we take the idea of economics and really think of that as exchange and giving and getting, we can already tell that the different people in this scenario are going to have different perspectives and, in a sense, different forms of exchange or economics in their own heads about what's important, about what they're willing to do, about how they think the next steps should proceed, or even if they should be included or not. So that sense of exchange is an important concept for us to think about. But we also start to recognize that this is not a simple case where it's one person making one decision. There are a lot of different inputs that different people have. And this idea of being able to connect what one person is saying with what another is thinking and another is behaving, this is going to be a complicated kind of case. And the reason this is important is that, again, nudges are often perceived as kind of smaller scale individuals making choices. And what we need to do in a situation like this is understand that broader context. And then finally, the idea of what's in somebody's best interest is an important concept to think about. So in this case, again, different people will have very different perspectives on what's in somebody's best interest. In one case, it might be trying to achieve a full recovery. In another case, it may be making sure that the organs are well preserved and make sense to transplant later. So the different perspectives different people have will create complexity as we move forward.
So now it's 12 hours post-presentation. The patient had lost most of his brainstem reflexes while in the emergency department, and he has been transferred to a medical center for a higher level of care. When he presents to the second hospital, he is posturing on all four extremities. His CT brain does show diffuse subarachnoid hemorrhage and intraventricular hemorrhage. The family is focused on his recovery, while the treatment team has already held multiple family meetings and has given a grave prognosis. The OPO has still not been consulted and considers this, again, a missed opportunity to educate the family about the medical process, communicate grave prognosis, and better manage the family's expectations. So what insights can behavioral design provide at this stage in the interaction?
So to think about some of the things that are driving some of the tension here, I think it's important to touch on how when we're interpreting things in the present that are right in front of us, it's largely based on our personal history and exposure to similar situations. So in most cases, people rely heavily on past experiences and their training to help them determine what proper behavior looks like in any given situation. It can help us make decisions more quickly and easily, but it can also lead us to skip over details that don't match the narrative that we're accustomed to seeing or that we want to see. So what we call this confirmation bias. It's where we tend to interpret new evidence as simply confirmation of existing beliefs, theories, preconceptions. This can also be heightened in emotional situations, as well as situations where we need to interpret a bunch of ambiguous information, both of which we're seeing here. So in this particular situation, we're seeing confirmation bias playing out in a couple different ways. So for OPOs, when they're in the hospital, they're there for one big reason. Death is imminent. Decision-making about donation has to be made soon. What this does, it primes them to interpret events, outcomes through that primary lens, which may or not be shared with other parties. For the OPO, there's a process. It has to happen quickly, and in the rush, they may not always communicate that with clarity. For treatment teams, they see a greater diversity of outcomes from day to day. Some cases have positive results. Some have patients making full recoveries and walking out. For them, donation is just one potential path. And families, they're overwhelmed. So what's going on with my loved one? The desire for any bit of certainty here is extremely strong, and families may simply ignore evidence to the contrary. So one thing that's underscored is the need to always have one person in charge. As we're seeing here, the OPO, they haven't been called in yet, but when they do come in, they're going to have a specific goal. And treatment teams, they still own the situation. That can lead to confusion. Additionally, there do remain some preconceptions about organ donation being opportunistic. Now, that could be one more factor that plays into their confusion and fear. So as you can see, each of these parties have different exposures to previous behavior. It's rather different. They're seeing things as they've been primed to see them. That impacts their reactions. It impacts how they read what is right or wrong. Kind of an overarching point you can take from this is really everything can be seen as a feedback loop. Behaviors really don't happen in isolation. For every party here, I've already pointed this out, previous behavior provides the grounding for how current actions are interpreted. So we need consistency in action and communication. For OPOs, they got to understand they have to face their organization. How they act now impacts future referrals, collaboration with the treatment team. The hospital is doing what it knows it has to by calling a referral. The referral is a known disruptor, and it can impact how they want the situation to proceed, the resources they know they need to carry out their job. So again, nothing happens in a vacuum. One bad encounter does feed the next. An OPO coming in and making demands or being perceived as difficult can mean that providers might be slower next time engaging them, which means they'll come in feeling rushed, out of the loop, and that drives further negative behavior and so on.
So moving on with the clinical case, despite aggressive treatment, the intracranial pressures continue to rise, and the treatment team recognizes that clinical condition is refractory to maximal medical therapy and will likely lead to brain death. The family remains hopeful, and the treatment team's discussions with the family has transitioned to discuss brain death, and that word is being used now. And for them, the next step is brain death testing. A referral has been finally made to the OPO, and the OPO staff report on site to evaluate for donation potential. How might behavioral design explain these tensions?
So, again, at the center of all this, there's a loss of life. And around that, there are multiple ways, multiple perceptions and perspectives about how that loss is seen and felt. And some of those are in natural conflicts with each other. So, of course, for the family, there's the loss of a family member. But there's also a perceived loss of control, or even any sense of certainty that they may have felt they had in their larger life in the hospital or elsewhere. Now, OPOs, by definition, exist to make organ donation happen, and they view this as an inherently positive event. For the OPO, the circumstances of this referral put that donation at risk, which affects how they approach the family and facilitate the overall situation. And for the treatment team, the loss of a patient's life could be seen as a failure of the team involved, of the doctor, of the process, or the hospital. Also, the nature of donation itself can feel at odds with how the hospital naturally allocates resources. When they make a referral, important resources such as time, personnel, space, they're diverted from other patients that have their own needs. So donation isn't the only thing that matters for them. Again, what we see here is a misalignment between expectations and goals.
Now we're hospital day 3, and the patient has lost all brainstem reflexes and has become hypotensive. The family has started to shut down. They are no longer communicating effectively with the treatment team, and they are not indicating their understanding or acceptance of the gravity of the situation. The treatment team is using the death language, which is leading to a flare-up of denial, anger, and mistrust within the family towards the treatment team. And the family is in opposition of brain death testing. How might behavioral design explain these tensions?
So now that we've played through the arc of this particular scenario in this case, we've not only identified that there are difficulties in terms of communication, there's also a lack of clarity about what to do or even who is driving the procedure and who is driving the process. And there are many, many preconceived notions that may be in play here as well, whether that's the family sort of hearing what they want to hear and thinking about what the future brings for someone who's been potentially in an accident. There's the preconception about the OPO's perspective. They think that they should have been brought in earlier. So we have a lot of conflicts. There's a lot of complexity here. And although behavioral design and behavioral insights are never going to solve every single one of these, what they can start to do is to help us understand and unpack a little bit what are some of these underlying situations and underlying things that we can be more thoughtful about that can help us to then diagnose and understand what to potentially do better the next time around. So we've already talked about things like confirmation bias, where we see what we want to see, and the idea and the perception of loss, that everyone is feeling this loss in many different types of ways. But when we talk about how people behave, quote unquote, irrationally, the emotional state is also a very, very important piece of this, of course. And so the fact that it's very hard to make good decisions even when you're in a rational state, and when you're highly emotional, that's even more the case. So this is another lens that we can bring to the table. And underlying all of these things really is a sense of just underlying uncertainty. And uncertainty is a state that people are just notoriously pretty bad at dealing with. And that can be uncertainty even in small ways. So when we think about everything that's going on in this case and all the heightened needs that are happening, this degree of uncertainty is absolutely high. And what's interesting is that even one of the very, very first papers that started to spell out this new field of behavioral economics, and this was back in the 1970s, was actually about this very idea of judgment under uncertainty. So this sense of uncertainty being a driving factor for irrational behavior is longstanding and becomes part of why we see conflict in a bunch of different ways between individuals, between groups, and these ideas that can help us to understand how to better communicate By delving into this a little bit, we can start to understand the why behind what went wrong. So one way to think about this uncertainty and one way to cut in, and this is obviously an extremely oversimplified way to think about it, but we can start to tease out, for example, some of these causes of uncertainty. So the idea Paul already described about exposure to situations, your incoming perceptions, can absolutely drive how you think about what's happening next. So if we think about this very simple framework of something you see frequently to something that's very infrequent, something which is highly significant in your life to something which may be insignificant, you can start to identify already that the types of decision making and the types of perceptions you have are going to play very, very differently in different areas here. So if you are making a very frequent decision that's not that important, like where to get coffee, your decision making process is going to happen very quickly. You don't feel any high degree of risk, and the uncertainty is pretty much nothing. By contrast, in this situation, the family circle here could pretty much be off the page in the top right. It's a highly, highly significant situation, and it really is not something that they deal with on a regular basis, if at all. And so everything about this situation is very, very new, and they don't have any previous experience to rely on to actually understand what to do next or what's coming. For a treatment team, this idea of death or dying or being in a hospital setting is obviously much more familiar because it's a place where they spend time, but the organ donation process, and that may not be as common or as familiar, and therefore some of the mysteries of what the OPO is doing end up creating more uncertainty and more tension for a treatment team member. For the OPO, they have sort of an opposite problem where this idea that they know what to do and coming in and kind of have an understanding of the overall process and also a pretty directed idea about what needs to get done, that can contribute to what's called expertise bias, which is an assumption that everyone else knows as much as we do. And it can lead to both kind of tensions and also frustration when people aren't operating in a way that you think they are supposed to be. So this is one way in that we can start to understand. By knowing where everyone sits in this kind of area, we can start to think about, well, what are ways that we could start to address that?
So another way we can think about this, another driver of conflict we can see here is an aspect of how people manage their emotions and how that shapes what we see as logical actions and reactions in a certain context. This can be described as the difference between hot and cold decision-making states. So in behavioral research, the idea of hot and cold states describes the empathy gap that we all experience between our logical selves, the cold state, and our emotional responses and behaviors, the hot state. So when we're in a hot state, we tend to not understand how much our emotions are driving our behavior. We focus on immediate needs and goals, sometimes acting impulsively. Conversely, when we're in a cold state, it's difficult for us to imagine ourselves in a hot state, and we tend to underestimate the impact of our emotions on future decisions. So another way to understand this, think about hot and cold states, is to think about the self who sets an alarm for 4 a.m. to catch an early flight. That's very rational. That's the cold state version of you. But the hot state version is the one who has to deal with it, the one who's groggy, cranky in the morning, and maybe not really presenting their best self. So in a donation context, this is even more heightened. The emotional context further drives flare-ups in communication. This is an example on the right side of this page. Coupled with a lack of experience that Ruth was just discussing in this kind of decision-making for some of those involved, and the stakes at hand, it is hard to see how things can get muddled. For OPOs, this may be more of a cold state. They're familiar with the process. They know what should come next. They're thinking about organ viability, how to keep things moving. And that can lead to misperceptions from others that this is purely transactional and that they aren't invested in the family's experience. So another source of tension that we haven't quite touched on yet are social norms. Social norms, simply put, they're the often unstated rules of behavior in a certain setting or in an organization. Social norms inform and shape our behavior in a lot of subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways, some of which we can see here. For example, for family social norms, basically they're not in their comfort zone, to put it lightly. Okay, so there may be a lot of existing family dynamics that just go out the window here. They're unfamiliar with the hospital. They have a lack of confidence in medical terminology or process. Not to mention they're seeing a loved one in a position of extreme vulnerability. So this puts them in a very uncomfortable position. For OPOs, social norms, donation is seen as like their cause. That's why they're there. And they have a very specific idea about how professional expertise and role it plays and how a referral should be set up and carried out. For treatment teams, there are internal hierarchies and expectations on who is in charge at any given moment. As well as there may be a sense of the hospital as their territory that may increase resistance to others coming in and taking charge. So again, a common thing that keeps coming up here, each party bringing in a different set of norms influences how they think how things should be, and that can lead to conflict, especially when communication goes awry. Related to social norms are what we call implicit biases. So we all carry these around. These shape how we perceive others and their actions. And one thing about these is even when you're aware of them, it's extremely difficult to avoid or control for implicit biases. For example, in this situation, the individual, for example, might display attributes that tap into certain socioeconomic biases. For example, maybe they're a known drug user. I think that was discussed earlier, yes. Or maybe they're a gang member, or they have a criminal record. This may or may not have a direct impact on why they're at the hospital, but it may very well shape the perceptions of the family and others. This also happens with professionals in the hospital and OPO interactions. What is perceived as important or authoritative is often biased by things such as roles, titles, even uniforms. For example, even when the OPO knows the donation process best, it can be difficult to take control from a neurosurgeon, even when it's the expected and appropriate thing to do. Similarly, sometimes we make assumptions that people in a hospital setting are comfortable with death, and that itself can lead to confusing situations and further miscommunication.
So we know that there are a variety of challenges at play here, but what can we do?
So right now we've spent a lot of time kind of specking out the whole landscape of what might be going wrong and the different types of biases that are coming into play. And what we'd like to pivot to a little bit is to help to talk through, well, what are some ways that we can start to identify and diagnose our own situations, and even how we might start to use that knowledge to then convert that into opportunities for creating either simple interventions or communication tools which can help in these settings, so that the communication challenges that we've seen play out can be either reduced or in some cases eliminated. One way that we can do that, and this is kind of a designer way of doing things often, is to take one big problem and start to divide it into pieces so that we can understand how to cut in a little bit more easily. So what we see here is a way to break down this very, very complex system that we've been talking about, and from a behavioral perspective start to understand what that looks like. So we have 4 areas here, from individual perceptions, which are maybe more about communications and individual appeals to us as individual human beings, to what we might consider tools of the trade, which are about the mechanisms that we use to get our work done, to the context itself, which is quite important in this case, since this is all taking place in the hospital context and setting. And then finally, at the biggest cycle, sort of the biggest circle, this idea of rules and policies, which kind of set the groundwork for everything. So what we'll do is walk through these a little bit and understand what are the types of things that we can understand and to apply as tools in order to solve these problems a little bit better, and also provide some examples that may be familiar. So when we think about individual perceptions and how that impacts both what we do and how we interpret what's going on, that's very much about sort of us as individuals. We started out talking a little bit about this idea of identity or sense of self or kinship, and signals that can help us to understand both who we are important, but also help us to respond in the smartest and kind of most effective way. So one story that can bring this to life outside of a healthcare setting is actually goes back to a PSA that was launched in the mid-'80s called Don't Mess with Texas, which sounds like a rallying cry for Texas, but was actually around anti-littering. And it turned out that the primary litterers in Texas were young men in their late teens and early 20s. And when they were trying to think about a way to keep people from littering, they started out with what you might expect, which is to tell people not to do it or that it was bad. But what they found is that this idea of don't mess with Texas really resonated with these individuals because it spoke to a core piece of their identity. It was about them not being chastised, but them as kind of active people who were defending their turf. And it ended up with remarkable success. Within a year, it ended up with a 30% reduction in litter, and by 5 years, it was about 72% reduction. So even though this sounds very kind of completely different from this setting, it can show and demonstrate the power of how tapping into somebody's functional identity and the things that are important to them can really heavily change behavior in pretty remarkable ways. This can also happen more implicitly. So simply suggesting that you are like others who you want to be like can be effective as well. And this has been used from things as diverse as getting out the vote. If you're told that people in your neighborhood vote, you're more likely to because you want to be a stand-up citizen, and to things like saving the planet and to saving water and conservation, being aligned with something which is important to you. So these ideas about both the framing and message of who I am, but also what might be called social proof, which is that others are doing things that are important, that are like me, these are all very, very important tools that we can consider. How might we engage with other people with an identity that it's not just about what we're doing, but also who we think we are as human beings? So that's one way we can think about approaching some of these challenges. Another one, if we go out to the next circle, is this idea of the tools of the trade. So what are the things that I'm surrounded by, whether those are structures or processes or even computer systems that are fundamental to how I'm solving some of these problems? So in this case, the very fact that the process feels a bit mysterious is probably contributing to some of these challenges. That if I don't have insight into why somebody is doing something, it makes it a lot harder for me to think about what it is that I can and should be doing. So there are a few examples here as well that can be useful as we think about different touch points and different things that can help us to sort of circle on what can be a better solution. You may be familiar, for example, with Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto. And this is a book which looked to something very, very simple, like literally a checklist, which allowed us to see that something which is very, very simple and doesn't really feel like it will address the complexity can contribute highly to helping us to figure out what to do. And that is not because it's a very complex tool, but because it actually takes us out of our own heads. So if we think about how people can be irrational, a checklist is actually a wonderful kind of tool to help make us more rational because it gets us out of what we're thinking and what we're doing, and it puts it down in front of us. And it almost forces us to be much more methodological about what we're doing, and it can also become a shared artifact. If we as a community agree that this is how we'll proceed, it makes it a lot easier to A, come to that kind of agreement and point out when things are going wrong, but it also means that we can be much more comprehensive. There are other versions, of course, of checklists. For example, when we see situations where certain parties, whether it's women or certain ethnic minorities, are undertreated, for example, for certain types of conditions, something like this can be shown also to reduce that. And really, all of these are examples of externalizing something which is normally very internal. So in the case that we saw and discussed just now, many of these tensions and many of the challenges arose simply because there were perceptions that people had coming in, and there were misconceptions about how other people's behaviors then impacted what they did. So if we think about all of the parts and pieces of this donation process and the roles that people are playing, this idea of externalizing ideas and making it more concrete, even when there's pressure for time, there are sometimes tools that can help us to be a lot more careful and externalize what it is we're doing. And all of these things together can help us to both exchange information more effectively, create better handoffs, and even understand who the right person is to go to, which is often a challenge. So if we move out to yet another circle, we've talked already about the individual and about the tools. There are often elements that are existing in our environmental context, which are setting the tone for how we may or may not solve problems effectively. So in this case, the environment can consist of a few different things. Paul described the idea of social norms, for example. So what we do socially and how we think about what other people are thinking of us, but also just the norms and kind of unspoken rules of how people communicate. If you're in a hospital setting and that's what you're accustomed to, those social norms feel very natural. It's just the way that you do business, in the same way that someone who works in an office might understand the norms of an office situation and office behavior. But for people who are coming into this situation and it's new, that can actually be quite difficult to understand. It's almost like for a family visiting a foreign country, where they're now confronted by not only a very, very uncertain and highly emotional situation, but you're doing that in a land or in a country where you don't know the rules, and you don't know who to ask, and you don't know the behaviors that you're expected to exhibit or why other people do what they're doing. So all of these factors contribute to a context which can be very confusing, and often for the people who are exhibiting some of these behaviors, it may feel so natural to them that it really doesn't occur to them to explain. And of course, in a situation like this, where tensions are high and time is of the essence, there may simply feel like there isn't time to start to explain some of these things. There are also situations here where simply the physical space may have certain suggestions about what is appropriate or not appropriate. So if we think about waiting rooms, for example, where people sit or where they're allowed to spend time, these all create a sense of what's in and what's out and the exposure to what's going on. So it may be a situation where the social norms and how we think about behaving amongst each other combined with the physical space can lead to a lot of, again, more uncertainty and not recognizing what other people are bringing to the table. Added to this, even more complex, is this idea of the passage of time. So in this case that we described, there were many, many things happening over a long time. And not all of those things were felt necessarily as critical as the moments went on, and some things came to the fore a few days later. So this context can be both spatial, it can be temporal, and it can also be social, and they're all setting up a context for helping people to understand what's going on, but it also is often a case where there are challenges because people don't have that same shared sensibility. An example here that comes from outside of the healthcare context but may also be familiar, for example, Malcolm Gladwell has written about a plane crash that happened where there was an expectation of hierarchy in how people communicated, and it meant that a crash occurred which could have been prevented if people had talked to each other a little bit more urgently about what was going on. You can imagine a similar scenario here where if people, rather than thinking in terms of hierarchy or in terms of who is the right person to talk to, if there's clarity of roles but also flexibility to know when to bring the right ideas to the fore, that can make some of the social norms not go away, but can make them more obvious so that people can deal with them. And then finally, if we think about the bureaucracy and the rules and policies that we all function in, healthcare obviously has a lot of these going on. So it can be things like HIPAA, which we're familiar with, and there can also be some which are much more specific to the organ donation setting itself. So this can take a few different forms. One way that we can think about these external roles and rules and how they impact us are, again, they feel natural to us but may not be to others. They may be simply in terms of how we are held accountable for what we are doing. So in a case like this, it could be that the hospital staff and the treatment team just have different measures of not just success in terms of patient life, but in terms of expectations about productivity, in terms of who's working with whom. So there's a whole set of rules and structures and processes that a treatment team may be thinking about that are sort of shaping and informing the behaviors that they may be taking on. From the OPO perspective, there may be other ones. So thinking about how many organ donation situations you're going into, are there expectations about how many are going to work? This is where you end up with tension simply because people are, in a sense, working together and collaborating, but they're also potentially working in situations where there are tensions between kind of what they're being held to. And the reason that this is pretty important is because often what's measured is what ends up dictating behaviors. So we all want to do the right thing, but if something is being measured and we're being held accountable to it, or maybe even if our job or our salary relies on it, those things tend to take a heightened importance in contrast with other things which may slip. So the fact that we all may be playing with different ideas here is important. And even when we think about things like the legalities of the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, there are ways in which those, for example, set very, very clear guidelines, and yet it's still a situation in which we're functioning independently of one another in terms of our home base and who we work for. So that sets out a little bit of kind of some ways in which we can think about the problem solving, whether it's about personal appeals, whether it's about how we think about the tools and behaviors that we might use that are more related to the job, whether it's the external context and the rules and policies. And when we start to think about these things in Constellation, they can help us start to understand, well, what are some ways in which we can imagine where solutions might come in? And I would never propose that these are exactly the right ones. And in fact, in the real world, what you would do is create interventions and then test them, because that's the only way that you're going to see what actually works. But it can help us to see where we might introduce different types of settings and different types of situations that it can improve some of these communication difficulties. So for example, shared clarity around even who is leading a situation, so that you don't end up with a family who finds one person more accessible than another and then goes to that person for advice and information and discounts somebody else's. That can potentially be helped by more clarity and confidence and consistency, so that there's an understanding of who to go to, being able to channel those interactions through the singular person, for example, so that they don't accidentally read somebody else's potential good news as the way that they should go. So clarity and consistency can be helpful with this. Moving to the lower left, we talked extensively about hot and cold states. So the idea in recognizing that somebody who's in a very, very hot state is simply going to be managing information very differently than if they were in a very more rational cold state. So the way that you can even get senses of, is somebody in a heightened state of anticipation or confusion or anxiety? That can help us to recognize how we might want to encounter somebody, or how we might want to share information, or to recognize when to step away and let people cool down before encountering them again. So that can be another helpful prompt. The group norms, moving up to the top right, can also be valuable. The more that we understand why certain people are behaving in a certain way and how they're interacting with one another, can help make us more aware of behavior, but also reduce the likelihood of friction that may be personal, but it's really more driven by the role that that person is playing in a certain kind of interaction. And then finally, when it comes to things like sort of being more methodological about process and about what's going on, a checklist is not going to solve everything, but this can also, again, help to externalize why we're doing certain things. What is the process? What is the expectation? So that we can see what's coming up, as well as sort of set expectations for what's happening. So it can start to equalize the field a little bit about what's going on. And then an understanding potentially of what is it that is driving certain types of behaviors and the types of expectations that, for example, in their role, in their job, they're being held to. So this can be another way that in Constellation we can start to both identify where biases and tendencies exist, but also start to think about some ways to cut in and what is the right level. And typically an intervention this complicated, you would be thinking about all these different levels of a combination of both, say, personal interactions and environmental context. It's rare that you're going to find just one thing that solves for everything.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much to Ruth and to Paul for such an insightful presentation. Before I turn it back to Dr. John for questions, just as a reminder for everyone, if you have questions for our presenters, please submit them using the chat feature in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Now, during the Q&A time, I will have this poll up. For those of you who are listening in a group, please complete this poll and let us know how many people were listening in your group. That'll be very helpful for us. So at this point, I will turn it back to Dr. John to moderate our questions.
Thank you, Corey. Ruth and Paul, I do have a few questions, and here's my first one. What are other applications of behavioral design in healthcare?
Well, I can jump in with a couple, and then Paul, feel free to jump in as well. Healthcare is actually rife with many, many situations, partially because it deals with many of the tensions that people struggle with. So some of this are around things like self-control, which we know is very, very difficult for any one of us, but especially if you're trying, for example, to adopt new kinds of behaviors, or if you're trying to keep yourself on the straight and narrow with a different kind of diet. If you've just been diagnosed with diabetes, for example, and now suddenly your whole lifestyle changes, that's a very difficult behavioral switch. So there are many things around habit formation, for example, whether it's with dealing with illness or just in a wellness situation. You see a lot of things around medication adherence, for example. So if I start to feel better and then I stop taking medication, that's another behavioral challenge. And we've even seen, both Paul and I have worked on situations, for example, like helping people to sign up for Medicare. So not necessarily health treatment, but dealing with the medical system, which is very confusing, people don't have experience with. So those are just three top of mind. And Paul, not sure if you have some to add to this growing list.
Well, yes, you stole my reference to adherence, but a lot of what I've seen actually is, and you also just touched on that, Ruth, but about the order and framing and language in which certain kinds of pieces of information are shared with people. That's where I've seen some work where, instead of giving somebody a piece of information at X point in a process, they may hold an intervention where they deliver it in part earlier and then in part later. So really figuring out what are the right points in a specific experience, where somebody is most primed and ready to not only comprehend information but also act on it. So really it's kind of like thinking about the temporal aspect of things as well as the kind of framing effect. That's where I've seen quite a bit of work.
Thank you. What are some of the limitations of behavioral design in these kinds of contexts?
Well, we talked sort of early in the presentation about the idea that nudges are not necessarily going to change everything. And what's actually sort of interesting is that nudges have been used very effectively in an organ donation context, but it's more around helping people to sign up for organ donation. So it's probably a familiar setting, for example, where people have to opt out versus opt in. And what that really means is that if it's an opt-out situation, I'm defaulted into being an organ donor. And if I have to opt in, it means that I have to kind of explicitly and manually take that step. And there's been research done that if you're in a location where it's opt-out and you're automatically entered unless you excuse yourself, the organ donation rates are extremely high. And if you're in an opt-in situation where you have to make that choice, even if it's something that people generally believe in, it's just like this little extra step. And it means that oftentimes people don't do that. So I mention this because one of the challenges can be in a more communication context and in one that's a little bit more internally facing like this. Some of the tools that you might think of as part of the behavioral toolkit, like setting a default or creating an opt-out situation, we really don't have at our disposal. So there are ways in which wouldn't it be nice if we could say, oh, we'll just opt out of a difficult situation, but we don't really have that as an option. So in this case, some of the limitations are that what behavioral design can do, it won't necessarily help us to fix solutions in a very kind of automatic way, but what it can do is to help us understand, well, what are the reasons for certain types of behaviors and how might we start to increase or to dial up certain types of interventions. What can be helpful with that sometimes is user research. So in the design field, when we're working, for example, in healthcare, understanding from a user perspective, and that can be both a patient and a provider and health plan, kind of from all participants, that's helpful. And then definitely the idea of testing. So one limitation is that there simply is no magic bullet for any of this. It's often reliant on kind of identifying what a good solution looks like, formulating an intervention which is you hope is going to work and sort of is set up in the right ways. And then, of course, you want to test it because there are always unintended consequences potentially of what you've done.
Yeah, to build on that, I would just reiterate this point that Ruth has touched on about, these are behavioral tendencies. They're not guarantees of how people always act. So, I would joke about if you were to memorize all the biases and heuristics that you could become some kind of puppet master, but thankfully that's not the case. But as we point out, through research and through testing, you could start to see within a specific context you're trying to address, what are the interventions that are most suitable, and what's the kind of timing and delivery that makes them most effective.
Okay, so what tools exist to help teach these concepts, or how to apply an understanding of behavioral design?
So one place to go for additional resources, there are a lot of, and increasingly more and more, really good books. So it's not a tool per se, but great resources. So a couple that come to mind, which may already be familiar, one is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, where he talks about, in great detail, kind of his lifetime's worth of research. And this is somebody who also coincidentally won a Nobel Prize for his work in this space. So that's a way to understand across a broad swath what are the types of solutions or interventions and how they came about. Dan Ariely is another well-known person who's written books like Predictably Irrational. And that, again, is sort of diving into like why is it that we act irrationally and yet in a somewhat predictable way. It can be helpful to understand the why behind what we do and why we do things that seem like they're at odds with our best interest. Nudge is a familiar one by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And then there are books on habit, which are also very good. There's one in particular, The Power of Habit, that comes to mind by Charles Duhigg. So those are, I would say, a good constellation of books to read on the train and whatnot that kind of dip a lot more deeply into some of the concepts that we were only able to tap into a little bit here. So those are certainly from the reference and resource perspective one useful way to go.
Yep. Two more I'd add to that reading list. I'm currently reading Drive by Dan Pink. Really what motivates people to work or to do anything. I can personally attest it's a great read. Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. How do we really create lasting habits and behaviors? I think that's pretty meaningful here. And also, there's various universities, like, for example, University of Pennsylvania. They have the Center for Health Incentives and Behavioral Economics. There are a raft of studies that have been done there over the years on things like we discussed earlier around adherence, around timing and delivery and messaging. So I think there's a fair number of research institutions that are explicitly creating interventions and testing them that make use of a lot of this kind of core foundational thinking.
Thank you. I do not see any questions from the audience at this time.
All right, excellent. So yeah, it looks like we have gone through all of the questions that are in the queue. So we'd like to extend our sincere thanks once again to Ruth Schmidt and to Paul Keck, as well as to Dr. Sayona John for their time and for an outstanding presentation today. To all of our participants, we want to thank you for your time as well, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you and take care. And for our presenters, if you can hang with us for just a couple of minutes, I'll move us back into the speaker room and we'll do a quick debrief.